Scripture this morning is 1 Samuel 17, 38 through 40. 1 Samuel 17, 38 through 40. And Saul armed David with his armor, and he put a helmet of brass upon his head. Also he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. And he took his staff in his hand, and chose 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine.
Good morning. I'm kind of glad to be here this morning. I love this time of year. I like it when the weather is such that you go to work with a coat on and you leave it at work, and then you come back the next day, get ready to go to work, and by Friday you hope you have enough coats to get through the week, and you try to remember to bring them all home. That's kind of the way it's been the last little bit. And I love the fact that God is refreshing the earth. Our water table needed refreshing, and I love the rain. It does put as the old thing, it does make our spirits a little damp sometimes, but the truth of the matter is we really need it, and I appreciate that. I know our farmers appreciate it, even though it's not at the exact time that would be the best time, but for right now is a good time, and we need that. Yesterday, we had a great blessing. Gail and I were out. We had gone to an event, and after the event, we went by Sam's to pick up a few things, and we saw Will and Hannah Kay. And it's not just that we saw Will and Hannah Kay, it's that Hannah Kay and Will saw us first, and they came running up to us excited to see us. And when you get to be a certain age, it's nice to see young people that want to see you and want to come up and be in your presence. And you feel like maybe you had just a little bit of impact in their life if you see that, and it makes you feel special, makes you feel a little younger, and I appreciate that. So I wanted to share that. They're doing well, or looked like they were doing exceptionally well. So just wanted to share that. Today's lesson is called 5 Stones and a Smooth Delivery. And originally I was going to talk about David and Moses, but I decided to just leave it with David because he had kind of a smooth delivery apparently, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Yesterday we went to an event. Yesterday we went to Conway, and our granddaughter was performing in a dance recital. Now her part took about 2 minutes. About 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes. But she's 3 years old. And I was watching the dance teachers as they were trying to bring the 3-year-olds out onto the stage. And the 3-year-olds are all in their costumes. They're not in the room where they normally practice their dancing, where nobody can see them and they're able to not be distracted. They're going on a stage, most of them for the first time in their life. There are hundreds of people sitting out there watching with cameras and waving and things like that. Every possible distraction in the world, and it looked like they were herding cats. But they managed to get all the 3-year-olds in a line with quite a bit of help from the teachers actually grabbing them and putting them in their right position. They managed to get them all in the right place. They started playing the music, which in their case happened to be Rocking Around the Christmas Tree. And as the children were trying to dance, some of them actually were trying to follow the teachers and do the dance they had learned. Most of them were just impressed to be up on stage. It was great. It was great. They were so distracted. It was difficult, though, as the different groups came out, to recognize which kid was which from across a stage when they're all wearing exactly the same clothes and they've all got their hair done the same way. You know, when my son graduated boot camp, we watched all these groups of soldiers walk by, and we're like, well, is that him? Is that one him? Is that him? I know he's one of these because they all look exactly the same. They've got the exact same haircut. They've got the exact same clothes on. It's hard to tell one from another when you look at them. We went recently to Little Rock to watch the West Side High School band perform in a contest there, and our granddaughter was there. And her younger sister, Ashlyn, says, "Papa, it'll be easy to tell which one's Alexis. She's the one with the skirt on." You know, we all wear uniforms. Our uniforms may be different, whether we're a teacher or a bus driver, whether we're a doctor or a nurse, or whether we're a lawyer, or whether we're a banker, or whether we're a farmer, or whether we're a construction worker, or whether we're a roofer, whether we're a plumber. Our uniforms may be different, but we all wear what we used to call in the Navy, the uniform of the day. Each day at muster, the officer of the day would inform us, when I was in the Navy, what the uniform of the day was. Almost every day it was dungarees. What they call dungarees in the Navy, utility uniform. That was basically the uniform almost every day. Every now and then there would be a special occasion and the uniform of the day would be a dress uniform of one type or another. And then everybody had to scramble and try to find all the parts because you hardly ever wore that. And sometimes you had to do some quick laundry. Anyhow, that was the way it was. But we all have our uniform of the day, whatever it is. Our uniform of the day may change. When Rod comes in on a given morning, Rod may come in dressed to teach class at Southern Christian Home. He may go home and change to help somebody build a deck. He may come back and change so that he can cook for our Wednesday night meal, and then he may go home and change again so that he can teach Bible class that night. His uniform of the day may change 3 or 4 times a day. That's the way it happens when we do real life, right? But we all have that uniform that we wear, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. When David came to Saul and he was going to face Goliath, Saul offered him a uniform. He offered him his armor. And David said to him, "That's not me. I'm not used to it." You know, sometimes we think, well, you know, maybe there's a lot of reasons why I wasn't used to it. We'll talk about a couple of those as we talk about this a little bit. But the result was he couldn't fight in something he wasn't used to. He needed to be comfortable in his own skin, as it were. We talk a lot about that battle between David and the giant, Goliath. A mere shepherd boy, he went to the front lines. If anybody remembers why he went in the first place, he went to carry food for his brothers. His brothers were up there to fight, and David's bringing them a lunch. Now, that's not the way we think of war today. In our century, we don't think of war as being something where the kid brother could just walk up in amongst them and bring him some food. We think of a whole lot different battle lines. But their battle lines were drawn up, but they hadn't engaged in battle. For days, the Philistines had been lined up on one hill and the Israelites on another. Down below is a no man's land. Anybody that goes down there is bound to get killed. So the Philistines on one side, the Israelites on the other, had stood there and faced each other across this battle line for a period of time. And every day, Goliath, the champion of the Philistines, would come down the hill a certain ways and he'd say, "Send somebody to fight me. Anybody. If any of you has enough courage, come on down." I imagine he didn't use the king's proper English when he spoke. Well, in the first place, he probably spoke whatever language the Philistines spoke. But I'm sure he was very degrading of the Israelites and of their God and of their king as he challenged them day after day after day. And no one, especially not King Saul, has been willing to go down there and face him. And the consequences are grave because he says, here's what will happen. If I win, you'll be our slaves. If you win, we'll be your slaves. And now you've got a grave responsibility. It's not just your own life that's in jeopardy should you lose. It's the lives of your children. It's the lives of your wife. It's the lives of your neighbors. You're taking all of that upon you, and no one really wanted to step up to that responsibility against that giant. It wasn't just they were afraid of dying. We must understand that. There was more to it than that. There was a huge consequence involved in failure. And so they weren't ready for it. Nobody really wanted to do that. The responsibility is huge. That's why David had to explain to Saul why he was qualified. I think sometimes we overlook that part when we're reading it. We want to get to the part about beating Goliath. We don't like the part, or we're in a hurry and we read right through the idea. He had to convince Saul that he was capable of fighting the giant. He said, "Hey, look, man. Says, I've fought lions, saved lambs from lions. You know, I'm a warrior. You just don't know it. I may look like a kid, but I'm proven I can do this." And so he convinces Saul that he can fight the battle, and we know what happens. He wins the battle. But before the climax of the story, where he wins the battle, there's that story about the armor. You know, King Saul, when he found out David was willing to face Goliath, tried to make him look like a soldier. He tried to dress him in his own armor, give him his own sword and his own shield. Now, there's a couple of things about this. David was a Jewish boy. Saul is known to have been head and shoulders taller than anybody else. So now you've got a big, tall guy, a huge man, trying to give his armor to this smaller guy to wear. It would dwarf him to start with. It would be hard for him to wear somebody else's stuff. Gail teased me yesterday. I'm often, when someone's around me and they complain about being cold, I'm the first one to take off my jacket because I love the opportunity to get rid of my jacket. I'm the first one to take off my jacket and offer it to them to cover themselves with. And I have seen some of our ladies that are sitting here, I've seen some of you dwarfed in my jacket, or you could have put two of you in there sometimes, and maybe sometimes three. But that's okay. That's part of the project. When he offered it to him, David couldn't wear it. He couldn't wear it. But the scripture doesn't say David said it's too big. Scripture said David said he wasn't used to it. He wasn't used to it. Shepherds don't wear armor. There's not a whole lot of need for armor when you're out in the field with a bunch of sheep. There's nothing coming at you that's going to be armored to have to fight. And so the armor didn't fit him. Swords would have been kind of in the way for a shepherd out in the field. Can you imagine trying to run along following a bunch of sheep, or having a bunch of sheep following you, going through thickets and going through the grass in the fields and such like, with a sword hanging down at your side? It had just been in the way. That wouldn't have been something he'd have been familiar with at all. And a shield? Well, I want to protect myself from the sheep. That's not going to happen. You don't need those things. Those are not things he's familiar with at all. And so when it says he wasn't used to them, it wasn't just that the armor was too big. It was that none of these things would have been familiar to a shepherd boy. None of these things. He wouldn't have known how to use them. He wouldn't have understood that part at all. And so he had to do something different, because he wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a shepherd. He didn't fit into the uniform of a soldier. That's just not who he was. If he was going to win the battle, he had to win it as a shepherd. And there's a lesson here for us. Maybe it goes something like this. If we want to fulfill God's purpose in our life, we need to wear what's comfortable for us. We need to be in our own skin. We need to be ourselves, because I can't be you and you can't be me. Some here in this congregation have tremendous abilities that are far beyond anything I can imagine doing myself. And I have one or two abilities that some of you don't have. But between us, we have great ability together. But as we go about God's work, whatever God's work may call us to do, whether it's to teach a Bible class or to lead singing, whether it's to lead a public prayer, or whether it's to sit at home in private prayer over someone that's been rushed to the hospital. Or maybe it's to prepare a meal for someone who's been sick. Or maybe it's to make that encouraging phone call or send that card that helps somebody and lifts them up in the midst of their darkness. Whatever it is that God has called us to do, we need to wear the uniform that God has called us to wear. And that's a different uniform for each of us. And we need to understand that. That's part of being part of a church. Kim Gouliard, and I'm sure I said her name wrong, in her book, Clark's Battle, writes about Clark, and she starts off like this. She said, Clark sits in his dressing room alone. As much as he'd like to be able to settle down, he still finds it hard to relax. The excitement of the last 2 hours has left him dizzy. Yet somehow, with a lot of hard work and a great deal of prayer, he pulled it off. It had been a wonderful experience, one he would never forget. All the hours of practicing, all the money spent on music lessons, all the dedication and sacrifice had brought him to this point in his career, to be the guest soloist with the Toronto Symphony at Roy Thompson Hall. With his knees shaking, he walked out on stage to the polite applause of the capacity audience. With quivering hands, he raised the polished silvery flute to his lips, all the while wondering if he would make it through it all or pass out on the spot. Thanks be to God. All of his nerves vanished with the very first note. It came out clean and clear, a long, sustained high D, which seemed to hang ripe in the air to be plucked and enjoyed by all on hand. From then on, he lost himself in the music. He barely heard the orchestra as it played behind him. When it was all over, the audience erupted in applause. Bravo, bravo, they shouted. Then someone stood near the front, and next to him, a lady stood. Soon there were people standing all over the concert hall. In a moment, it was unanimous. Bravo, they shouted. Encore. He sits in his chair in the dressing room, savoring the memory. As he sits, he also waits. His father promised him he would meet him backstage after the performance. His father, his biggest critic, his toughest fan. This was the man who fought him over his career. His father, a successful business operator, worked his way up through sweat and toil to the top rungs of industry and expected him to follow. In his mind, Clark recalls a particular encounter between father and son. It happened when he was a young man, 19 years old. He stood before his father in his study. For the first time, he felt fear in the presence of his own dad. His father, a man who was used to getting his own way, stared at him. The anger in the room was intense. Clark had never seen him like this. All he could do was stare back with his mouth open, his eyes wide, his face white, his whole body shaking like a leaf as his father thundered. He can still hear his father's voice. What do you mean you decided not to attend Queen's University next year? You've been offered a full scholarship in the business program. That could take you a long way, boy. It could open a lot of doors. Can't you see that? Can't you see the opportunity this is for you? There are thousands of young men your age who would give their eye teeth for this opportunity, and you want to throw it all away. For what? To go to some highbrow music school and study the flute? The only place that'll take you is the unemployment line. What am I supposed to do? Support you for the rest of your life? And what kind of man plays a sissy instrument like the flute anyway? I always thought you'd grow out of this. I'm sorry now I ever bought you that silly glorified whistle. Come on, Clark, it's time to grow up. It's time to be a man and earn your keep. My advice is to forget about this flute craziness and settle down. The business I built will be yours someday if you only want it. Don't throw it all away chasing some dream that'll never come true. Clark could still hear the words ringing in his ears all these years later. They cut him like a knife. But he stood up firm, and for the first time in his life, he had stood firm in the presence of his dad where he wanted to stand. He had carved out his territory, and he was ready to make a stand on it against any threats. And the words came slowly to his lips. I'm sorry, Dad, I've made up my mind. I don't want to be a businessman. I don't want to run your company. It's your dream, not mine. Try as I might, and you can be sure that I've tried, I just can't fit into the suit that you've prepared for me. It's not me. I can't wear it. It's too heavy. It's too restrictive. And if I try to be the person you want me to be, I'll suffocate and die. All I'm asking is that you let me be what I feel called to be and don't make me live your dreams. Allow me the freedom to live my own life the way I feel God calls me to live it. It took eons for them to get back on speaking terms after that particular night, seemed like. And now he sits in his waiting room, in his dressing room, waiting for his father to show up again. How's he going to react? The answer is only time will tell, as Clark sits in silence and waits. You know, we're all called by our Creator to make choices and to fulfill our purposes in life. And we have various purposes. Paul says that the Spirit gives us gifts as the church has need. Not as we choose, but as the Spirit chooses. As the church has need, the Spirit gives us gifts, and we use those to the glory of God, and it benefits one another, and we see that. But how often do we sacrifice the blessings that God has given us on the altar of conformity or uniformity? We want to fit in. We don't want to stick out. You know, when we would have an inspection of any type for any reason, you did not want to be the one who stuck out. Not in the band, not in the Navy, not anywhere in the world. You want to fit in. In fact, the more you fit in, the less likely you are to get yelled at. And so you try even that much harder to fit in and fit in and fit in and conform. And in life, in so many of our workplaces, in so many of the things that we do in life, we go through life trying to fit in. But it's like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. As Christians, we're different. We're different. We're called to be different. We're supposed to be different. And if we're called to use our talents, and we try to hide our talents behind the uniform of something that we're not, we can't do what we're called to do. A mom encourages her daughter. She gives her a toy stethoscope, and she reminds her of how great it is working with children. She says, you know, being a pediatrician would be a really good career for you. You love children. God has blessed you. You've made straight A's your whole life. There is no greater calling than this for you. You can be successful, and you can be happy, and you can be prosperous if you become a pediatrician. And she doesn't realize that what the girl would really rather do is put on one of those little hats with the American flag on it and represent the United States in the Olympics. A dad goes out and buys his son a complete set of baseball stuff. Oh man, new bat, best bat on the market. He buys him the best glove he can, and he gets him a whole bucket full of baseballs, and he goes out and he says, son, he says, you can't imagine what it was like when I was growing up. I wish I would have had this opportunity that you have to play baseball. And he doesn't realize that the son has always thought that it would be really, really great to be a missionary in some field teaching people about God. You know, maybe it goes different than that. Maybe a husband looks at his wife and he says, I don't understand why you're not happy wearing an apron and taking care of the house and our children. There's no higher calling for a mom than to take care of the house and the children, and I can't understand why that's not a high enough calling for you and why you're not happy doing that. And the wife says, but you don't understand. All my life I've felt a need to help people, and what I really feel like I need to do is to take some classes at night and be a nurse and maybe be able to help people in a way that I can never do from sitting at home. A wife looks at her husband and she says, I bought you a new suit and a tie. You can be prosperous. Instead of working that dead-end job you're at, you need to go out and get a better job, and you can be more prosperous, and you can be more happy, and you can be more successful. And he says, but honey, you don't understand. There's nothing I would rather do in the world than to put on a scout leader's uniform and influence young lives. And I can do that with my current position. Maybe sometimes Society gets so busy telling us what we ought to wear that we forget to wear what God has given us. Society gets so busy telling us how we ought to live that we forget to use the gifts God has given us. And we don't do the things we could do because we're busy doing the things everybody else thinks we should do. And the result of the matter is that the things we ought to do don't get done because we're too busy being dragged down by the things we felt like we ought to do. It causes stress. It does. It causes great stress on us. You know, society tells us we ought to make lots of money and buy lots of stuff. That's what the goal of life is. You know, he who dies with the most toys dies with the most toys. You're still dead. You know, but we like toys. We like having more things. But wouldn't it be great if more people in the world could concentrate more on wearing a smile than what they're wearing? I'm not saying we ought to all run around naked with a smile. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying, wouldn't it be great if we spent more time focusing on happiness and sharing happiness with others than we do on all the things that try to make us conform with everybody else? I think so. I think so very much. Clark sits in his room and waits for his father's knock at the door. When it finally comes, it still surprises him. He gets up to open the door, and his father's on the other side. For the first time in his life, Clark sees his father timid. Without a word, he closes the door behind himself, coming into the room. "Well done, Clark," he says. "I have a gift for you." In his hands, a small package wrapped up in plain blue wrapping paper. Clark accepts it. "Thanks, Dad," is all he can think to say. He has no idea what to expect from his father. His father's never been one to buy gifts very much. He always just gave money or something like that. But this was a present. What could it be? Clark takes the wrapping away and discovers a box. He opens it, and to his surprise, finds a slingshot and 5 smooth stones. "That's interesting, Dad," Clark says, "but what's the purpose of this?" His dad replies, "It's like this, son. Just as David slew Goliath, you had your own giant to face. I'm sorry to say I was that giant. I'm the one who stood in your way and tried to rob you of your dreams. I was the one that tried to force you to be something you're not. The day you defied me and went to music school instead of business school, it was like hitting me between the eyes with a stone. But you had to do it, and look at where you've come. I'm so proud of you." You know, there's always going to be people who want to tell us what to do with our lives. There's always going to be people who are going to tell us, you don't need to do all that churchy stuff. There's always going to be people who'll say, well, you know, you're not a very good song leader. You shouldn't do that. There's always going to be people who'll say, you know, when you speak publicly, you're not as good a speaker as so-and-so is, and they're going to discourage us. But when God has given us a uniform to wear, we must wear that uniform. When God has given us a talent to use for His betterment, for His good, for the betterment of His church, we must use those talents, whatever they may be, because the Spirit gave them to us for just that purpose. So how about you? Have you been called to wear a different uniform than that you've been wearing? You know, has somebody else laid out your clothes for you? Now, I will say my wife lays out my clothes for me most of the time, because I'm colorblind, and if she doesn't do it, I look silly. I don't know that I look silly. I think I look pretty hot, but she says I look silly. Yes, we need doctors and nurses and teachers. We need all of those people in our life. We need preachers and song leaders. But we also need people who bring light to our life through art and entertainment and other things that we take for granted the beauty that's around us in the world and the people who are around us in the world. In 1777, Valley Forge was an ugly place. There's no doubt about that. More soldiers died of disease than died of anything else during that time. Many of them died of cold. Most of them died of things that would not have been life-threatening had it not been for the harsh conditions at Valley Forge. And yet, the Army managed to maintain. One of the reasons was because a young officer's wife, her name was Mary Ludwig Hayes, her father or her husband was a cannoneer. He had a whole brigade of cannons, and he was losing people. More people deserted than died at Valley Forge. There were a lot of desertions. She came in with food and a smile. And this young woman in a dress and an apron walked among the soldiers and kept their courage up a little bit. And when they went across the Delaware, when they went to Trenton and they won, they went to a place called Monmouth. And one of the biggest battles of the Revolutionary War was fought at Monmouth. And at Monmouth, this lady went among the soldiers that had fallen with water and words of comfort. We remember her as Molly Pitcher. Many people say, oh, that's a fictional character. It's a conglomeration of several women throughout the Revolutionary War who stood up. And that's possibly true. There may not have been a particular Molly Pitcher, but we know that Mrs. Hayes, went out among the troops, and she carried them comfort, and she carried them water. Her uniform was totally different than theirs. It was a dress and an apron. It was a bonnet on her head. Their uniform was totally different than hers. There were rags and tatters of what was left of maybe a homespun uniform, or possibly if they had been able to get one of the uniforms that was issued, maybe they had a boot, maybe they were lucky and had two, and maybe if they were really, really lucky, the boots had soles on the bottom of them that came with the boots and weren't just tied on, a piece of strip of leather or wood. They didn't look anything alike. Their functions were nothing close to the same. But the Battle of Monmouth was won by those who did what they were supposed to do. And the battle of life is won by those of us who do what we're supposed to do. Whatever it is we're called upon to do, whatever your uniform may be. We are at that time of year when everybody starts talking about, let's all be Christians, the exact same kind of Christian together. And what I call us to be is, let's all be ourselves. Let's all do our part, whatever our part may be. One may be able to give great things and great gifts. Another may be able to wrap those gifts. Someone else may be able to hand them over with a smile. And someone else might be the one who made those gifts in the first place. Whatever gift God has given to you, we challenge you to use it for the good of His church. And if we do, we'll be stronger. All of us. We'll smile more, we'll be happier, and we'll all be in the right uniform. Maybe you're not a member of the church. Maybe you've never been baptized into Christ. God adds you to His church as soon as you're saved, and if you're not, have not been added to His church, why not take care of that? Why not become a part of the body of Christ and experience the blessings that entails? If you are a member of the church, if you need prayers, we can help you in any way. Come forward, and we'll help you while we sing to encourage you.